Well, we are continuing our series in Exodus, and I have thought it has been real fun. It has been really cool to look at all this stuff and see what God did, and it's really incredible to see how He was able to work through these circumstances that were at hand. Last week, we saw 5 out of the 10 plagues, and one by one, we saw how God specifically targeted the gods of Egypt. He's judging them one by one. Not only that, he's judging the people of Egypt who are worshiping these false gods, these demons who are masquerading as gods. So God has come in and he's rescuing Israel. He's taking them out of the land. And from the get-go, Moses was like, God, I don't see how in the world you're going to do this. And God's like, oh, just you wait. I'm going to do it. Not only that, they're going to give you all of their silver and gold. You're going to plunder Egypt. You are going to leave, and they are going to ask you to leave. And Moses is like, do you see what's going on? I don't understand how that's going to happen. And God's like, just you wait. God was showing that he is running the show, not these false gods that are demons, again, that have convinced Egypt that they were gods. And what's interesting is the word plague that we get from Hebrew actually can translate also to strike. So it's like literally God is striking these gods off, like one by one, striking them down. This is a battle between I am, the great I am, versus literally demons who are masquerading as gods. And it was interesting because we see these magicians of Egypt who are able to copy what Moses can do. To start with, they can. They're able to mimic what God is doing. However, as each of these plagues or strikes are happening, one by one, the magicians are losing their power. They're not able to copy what God is doing. And Pharaoh is kind of stuck in this, between a rock and a hard place here. Because Pharaoh, by definition, he is a god who rules over Egypt. So he's got to maintain that. Like, he's like, oh my gosh, I got to maintain this godlike image. And now the God of Israel, our slaves, is taking out my power. Last week, the last plague we looked at was the 5th, where God kills off the livestock. So we're going to pick up here in Exodus chapter 9. And this is going to be the 6th plague. And we're going to be on chapter 9, starting in verse 8. Let me take a real quick sip here. You flip over there. Exodus 9, verse 8 is where we're starting. It says, Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Take handfuls of furnace soot, and Moses is to throw it toward heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. It will become a fine dust over the entire land of Egypt. It will become festering boils on people and animals throughout the land of Egypt. So they took furnace soot, stood before Pharaoh, and threw it toward heaven, and it became festering boils on people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had told Moses. So again, God called this out saying, hey, look, I'm going to do all these things. Pharaoh's not going to listen to you. But that's okay. I'm still in control, and I've got this. In the last verse here, where it says, But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had told Moses. I want to address this part here. All through the account of Exodus, really it's an examination of human evil and God's goodness and how they interact. I mean, the way that it was written in Hebrew, the way that the author structured this story of the plagues and getting Israel out, like that's supposed to be the literary focus is human evil and how God deals with it and how his goodness interacts with all of this. But if we don't read closely, it can be easy to mistake what the author of Exodus is saying. Interestingly, in Hebrew, it actually reads that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and it leaves it ambiguous as to who did the hardening. Okay? It's just left at Pharaoh's heart was hardened. God is telling Pharaoh, you cannot define good and evil on your terms. Because again, you got to remember, he is the king of Egypt, the emperor. He is both the ruling government of Egypt, but also the God in human form over Egypt. And realistically, he's just a human. And he knows that deep down. I assume he knows that deep down. But that's his job. He has been elevated to this position, so he's kind of got to maintain. You know, if you're going to stay in charge, you got to look like you're the God and the government. So God, all through this account of Exodus, he's telling Pharaoh, you are defining good and evil on your terms. In other words, enslaving other people, using them for your gain. And you're not allowed to do this. I'm the one who defines good and evil, not you. And Pharaoh, all through Exodus, is representing human evil. And we see God still use Pharaoh to accomplish his plans. I want you to listen to this quote, and I'm not going to have it on the screen here, but I'm going to read it to you. And it's a great article, and I highly suggest you read it. It's a very quick read. But the article is called, If God Hardened Pharaoh's Heart, Did God Cause the Evil? And it's written by Tim Mackie. You may recognize his name. He's from the Bible Project. But he's got this great quote here. It says, the author wants us to see that even the most heinous and absurd forms of human evil are not a true threat to God's purposes. He can steer even this kind of evil toward his plan to bless all humanity through Abraham's family. So again, we're seeing this interplay of human evil and God's goodness and how it works. Later on in the article, Tim writes, the fact that God can steer evil towards his purposes does not mean he engineered it. Pharaoh is responsible for his own evil, just as Joseph's brothers were. This is how great a God we serve. This is how great the great I Am is. He's able to take evil and repurpose it for his good. And we saw this even earlier in Exodus when Pharaoh had set a law that Hebrew baby boys be thrown into the Nile. And God literally uses the Nile to save Moses and thus saves the rest of Israel. He's repurposing this evil plan for his good. And again, if you're interested in how all this works with Pharaoh's heart being hardened, I really suggest you read that article. And if you're interested, I'll even I don't know if you have iPhone or Android, I don't care. I'll send it to you. It's a really good article. So Pharaoh has just witnessed this outright attack on another goddess of his in the form of boils on Pharaoh and all the magicians in all of Egypt. This plague was a direct attack on the goddess Sekhmet, the Egyptian goddess of healing and protection from disease. So God's showing, okay, this is another god that you worship. They are not in control. I am. I am the one who brings sickness. I am the one who brings health. This is the first plague that causes actual discomfort for Pharaoh and his magicians. So far, all the plagues have been inconvenient. You know, it hasn't actually physically affected Pharaoh, but this is the first one where Pharaoh is actually being physically affected. Now, Pharaoh's health is being affected, as we just said, and God sends Moses to tell Pharaoh to let all the Hebrews go and worship him. And he tells Pharaoh, I'm about to send, again, this is God speaking to Pharaoh, okay? Says, I'm about to send all of my plagues against Egypt. He then tells him, by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague, and you would have been obliterated from the earth. And he tells him, I could have wiped you off the face of the earth. And if you remember, last week we saw God intended to kill Moses. Do you remember that little interesting side detail in the story? He had not circumcised his son, and it said God intended to kill Moses. Now, what do we know about God? God is not limited by time and space. If he really wanted to take Moses' life, he could have done it in an instant. And he purposely did not take Moses' life because he was giving him an opportunity to make right what was wrong. That's a very important note here because the same thing is happening here with Pharaoh. God's saying, I could have wiped you off the face of the earth, but I haven't. Why is that? Well, it's because God is giving Pharaoh chances to obey, chances to acknowledge God's sovereignty and authority, but also God is using Pharaoh's rebelliousness and his unwillingness to repent in order to reveal his power, his authority. In fact, he literally tells him, I have let you live, like I've let it go this far in order that my name may be proclaimed over the whole earth. Nice. I didn't even reference it. Thank you. It says, however, I have let you live for this purpose, to show you my power and to make my name known on the whole earth. That is why God was allowing it to go this far. If we go to the next, you are still acting arrogantly against my people by not letting them go. Tomorrow at this time, now this is important, read this. Tomorrow at this time, I will rain down the worst hail that has ever occurred in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Therefore, give orders, again, this is God speaking through Moses to Pharaoh. Therefore, give orders to bring your livestock and all that you have in the field into shelters. Every person and animal that is in the field and not brought inside will die when the hail falls on them. Okay? God is giving very clear warning to Pharaoh, saying, bring in your livestock, bring in your servants, anything you don't want destroyed, bring it inside because it will be destroyed. God is making the point that he is in control here. And so he's threatened this hail. He's threatened that it's going to be the worst hail in all of Egypt's history. Crops, livestock, servants, all things will be destroyed. Exodus 9:23 through 26. So Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail. Lightning struck the land, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. The hail, with the lightning flashes through it, was so severe that nothing like it had occurred in the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout the land of Egypt, the hail struck down everything in the field, both people and animals. The hail beat down every plant of the field and shattered every tree in the field. The only place it didn't hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. So when we're reading that last section of verses, it's saying that there were people and livestock in the fields after God had explicitly warned Pharaoh, take everybody out, and he didn't. He did not listen. That was 100% on Pharaoh. This strike was against Nut. I don't name him. That's just what the name is. The Egyptian goddess of the sky who controlled the weather, once again showing that God is the one who is in control. There are no other gods before him. Again, God literally told Pharaoh, tomorrow at this time, hail is coming that will kill people. Call all your livestock and your servants to go inside so that they will be spared. And Pharaoh gave no call because of the hardness of his heart, and people died. Finally, we see Pharaoh begin to give way. He calls for Moses and Aaron, saying, I have sinned this time. The Lord is the righteous one, and I and my people are the guilty ones. Now, at this point, it's like, who said that? It was Pharaoh. And he says, make an appeal to the Lord. There has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't need to stay any longer. Again, I imagine Moses being like, finally, it's about time. Exodus 9:29 through 30. Moses said to him, when I have left the city, I will spread out my hands to the Lord, and the thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know the earth belongs to the Lord. But as for you and your officials, I know that you still do not fear the Lord God. We're told, so after that section of verses, I didn't include it here, but it's a verse that tells us that their barley and flax crops were ruined. However, their wheat and spelt were still intact. Excuse me. The hail took out the barley and the flax crops, but the spelt and the wheat are still intact. So what does that tell us? That half of their crops were just wiped out by the hail, just rendered useless, not able. In fact, it said that the barley was ripe and the flax was budding, so it was getting ready to be harvested. Listen to this nonsense. Exodus 9:33 through 35. Moses left Pharaoh in the city and spread out his hands to the Lord. Then the thunder and hail ceased, and rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain, hail, and thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his officials. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he did not let the Israelites go as the Lord had said through Moses. He hardened his heart again, not letting them go. Exodus 10:3 through 6. So Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh and told him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may worship me. But if you refuse to let my people go, then tomorrow I will bring locusts into your territory. They will cover the surface of the land so that no one will be able to see the land. They will eat the remainder left to you that escaped the hail. They will eat every tree that have grown in the fields. They will fill your houses, all your officials' houses, and the houses of all Egyptians. Something your fathers and grandfathers never saw since the time they occupied this land until today. Then he turned and left Pharaoh's presence. At this point, we're given a little bit of a scene into Pharaoh's court with his officials. And in fact, one of the officials even tell him, how long must you let this man, Moses, be a snare to us? Let the men go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Don't you realize yet that Egypt is devastated? So people under Pharaoh are realizing half our crops are gone, and you're still not letting them go worship the Lord their God. I want to bring it up again. Last week, we had talked about how when they first approached Pharaoh and they said, hey, we want to go worship God is calling us to go worship the Lord. We got to go leave the city. We got to leave Egypt, go make sacrifices to him, and we'll come back. That was the original deal. And what makes it really interesting is Egyptologists, that's their official title, have found papyrus and limestone that is engraved in Egyptian, and it's an account of slaves who have gone and made sacrifices to their gods. So this is not an uncommon occurrence. In fact, it was common back then. I mean, literally the list says Fred, not there because he's sacrificing to this god, took the day off. So it was a common occurrence for people to leave and go worship their God. So for Moses to make this ask should have been a slam dunk, easy. Pharaoh should have gone, yeah, not a problem. You go do that. But instead, he chose to harden his heart. And that's why all these plagues are coming. Excuse me. So again, we're seeing Pharaoh's officials begin to crack, saying, we've just lost half our crops. The God of Israel is threatening that the rest of our crops will be eaten, and you're telling their God no? Like, what are you thinking? Moses replies, So Pharaoh kind of gives way a little bit, and he says, okay, who exactly has to go to worship this God of yours? Like, Pharaoh, just let him go. It doesn't matter. But Moses replies, all the men, women, children, our flocks, and our herds. Then Pharaoh replies with words I'm sure he lived to eat and regret. The Lord would have to be with you if I would ever let you and your families go. Look out, you're heading for trouble. Pharaoh literally spoke that to Moses. Incredible. Amazing. astounding. I don't know if he has amnesia or what's going on here, but sin can make you forget a lot, I guess. God commands Moses to stretch his hand over the land, and locusts come, and everything was covered. All plants were devoured. Again, earlier, the author noted flax and barley were ruined when the hail came, and now spelt and wheat are now devoured by the locusts. The earth is barren at this point. There were no crops left in Egypt, and this was a clear shot at Seth, the god of chaos and destruction, as well as Neper, the god of grain. These were the gods that were supposed to protect Egypt against chaos, that were supposed to provide grain to the Egyptians, but clearly they had no power. So Exodus 10:14, the locusts went up over the entire land of Egypt and settled on the whole territory of Egypt. Never before had there been such a large number of locusts, and there never will be again. Go ahead and jump down. Exodus 10:16 through 20. Pharaoh urgently sent for Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Please forgive my sin once more and make an appeal to the Lord your God so that you will just take this death away from me. Moses left Pharaoh's presence and appealed to the Lord. Then the Lord changed the wind to a strong west wind, and it carried off the locusts and blew them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust was left in all the territory of Egypt. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the Israelites go. Then God spoke to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, and there will be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be felt. So that's really interesting, a darkness that can be felt. This is showing us that, this is not just a normal darkness. This is not just the lights are turned off. This is more to it than that. It's a supernatural darkness, if you will. Exodus 10:21 through 23. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, and there will be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was thick darkness throughout the land of Egypt for 3 days. One person could not see another, and for 3 days they did not move from where they were. Yet all the Israelites had light where they lived. This was a decisive blow and victory against Ra, the Egyptian sun god. He was supposed to bring life and energy and light to Egypt. Note again that God said this darkness could be felt. So this is, again, not just the absence of light. This interrupted their life for 3 whole days. They couldn't even see each other. Everything was put on hold. They couldn't do anything. And then read with me, Exodus 10:24 through 29. Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, go, worship the Lord, even your families may go with you. Only your flocks and herds must stay behind. Dang, dude. Moses responded, you must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings to prepare for the Lord our God. Even our livestock must go with us. Not a hoof will be left behind, because we will take some of them to worship the Lord our God. We will not know what we will use to worship until the Lord, we will not know what we will use to worship the Lord until we get there. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was unwilling to let them go. Pharaoh said to him, leave me. Make sure you never see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you will die. As you've said, Moses, I will never see your face again. Now that is spoken like a man who's truly confident there. Again, I want you to see the purpose in all of this. This part of Exodus is intentionally structured like this. The constant back and forth between Pharaoh and God. Moses is watching all of this unfold. Pharaoh giving way to his rebellious nature. He hardens his heart. He won't let the people go. Then God humbles him, and he finally begins to give way, and he agrees to only let the men go worship, well, but not the families. And then Pharaoh agrees to let the families go, but not the livestock. And like at every turn, Pharaoh is just choosing to fight against God, even though it is to the detriment of Egypt. They've lost all their crops. They've lost livestock. They have experienced disease. All the fish in the Nile died because it turned to blood. All these things. Egypt has lost much. But again, Pharaoh is choosing to fight against God. And God has been incredibly patient with Pharaoh in all of this. He warns him every time, let my people go that they would worship me. And he even tells them the consequences. If you don't let my people go, this is going to happen. You don't want this to happen. And Pharaoh's like, you're right, I don't want that to happen. But go ahead and do it anyway. Like, sign me up. I'm there. Let's go. And God's like, okay, all right. I think it was most shocking to me when God warned him about the hail. He says, bring in your servants and your livestock so they won't die. And Pharaoh ignores this warning, and people lost their lives because he chose not to warn them about it. Again, as I noted earlier in the sermon, it's at this point we begin to see the advisors begin to be shaken. If you could pull up Exodus 10:7 again for me. It says, Pharaoh's officials asked him, how long must this man be a snare to us? Let the men go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Don't you realize yet that Egypt is devastated? And yet, Pharaoh is like locked into a death spiral. He can't let this go. But let's look at God and what he's doing here. He gives Pharaoh chance after chance after chance to surrender each time. And he's transparent with Pharaoh. Again, he tells him, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. Like he tells him the details. God tells us exactly why he's doing this. Exodus 9:16. However, he's speaking to Pharaoh, however, I have let you live for this purpose, to show you my power and to make my name known on the whole earth. And you know what? It is the year of our Lord 2025, and we are still talking about the Lord our God. God was using Pharaoh's wicked heart and his rebelliousness to make his name known, to show his power. And I mean, he's really kind of educating the Israelites here as well, because keep in mind, they've been slaves in Egypt for, if I remember correctly, 400 years at this point. So to them, like they're like, oh yeah, I remember our forefathers worshipped, this God who promised us like some land, but we don't really know much about him. And so this is God showing Egypt his power, just as much as it is him showing Israel their power. God's also showing his grace. Again, he told Pharaoh, I could have wiped you off the face of the earth. I could have taken your life in an instant, but I haven't. And he's chosen to be very patient with Pharaoh. Pharaoh's refusal to obey God also gave God the opportunity to judge these demons pretending to be gods in Egypt. God was able to show that they had no real power and that I am is the one true God who rules over all domains of life. So how does this apply to you? I don't think you are counting on your spelt and wheat crops this year, but how does it apply to you? Well, for starters, do you acknowledge God? Like, are you a Christian? Do you know that you have been saved by Jesus? Has Jesus paid for your sins? Do you line your life up with what his word says? And these are like diagnostic questions for you guys, right? Like these are just questions to kind of get you thinking like, man, am I really doing what God asks me to do? Is my life different because I'm a Christian? Do you obey his commands because you love him? I mean, that's what Jesus told us, that we love the Lord our God by obeying his commands. We saw with Pharaoh, he was given chance after chance after chance after chance. And in fact, if you count them up, there were like 10 chances. For you, God will be patient. But as we see with Pharaoh, and especially as we'll see next week, those chances can run out. Are you going to use God's grace and actually turn to him, or will you keep missing opportunities to turn your heart to him? Lastly, I want you to see that God can use all circumstances for his glory and our good. God uses Pharaoh and his sinful heart to accomplish his good. Just like he uses fallen, broken people all over the Old Testament. I mean, gosh, for crying out loud, when we were going through Genesis, we saw that. Use these broken, messed up people. I mean, Abraham, Joseph's brothers, all these people who had sin in their life, who, for all intents and purposes, were broken. But God was still able to use them to accomplish his perfect plan. Just like he uses broken people today to spread the gospel. Not only that, here in Exodus, God uses Pharaoh and his sinfulness to prove that he is God over all aspects of life. There are no weak spots that God has. He will never step into a situation, so to speak, metaphorically, right, that he cannot handle. There's no part of creation that is outside of his control because God reigns supreme. Will you give him the glory and worship that he deserves? Will you obey him? Right now, our marching orders as Christians is to share the gospel, to cultivate fruits of the Spirit, and to point those around us to Jesus.